to the debrief, everybody. Opening statements in the Arizona trial of a man accused of shooting a LivePD officer in the face. Ramon Bueno is the defendant. Trooper James Casey is the victim who survived. Casey is expected to testify, and he said on Twitter he's been waiting for this trial for years. With us tonight, our attorneys Dina and Kenney Baden, along with forensic death examiner Joseph Scott Morgan. Let's begin with the state's opening statements.
This is a case about a documented Mexican mafia gang member who had such little regard for life and law enforcement that he shot a DPS trooper dead in the face within less than a foot, simply for the reason he did not want him to know who he was. He also did this in front of a documented fellow gang member of the Mexican mafia. And in that world, in his world, that is the ultimate act of violence and prestige. He shot again at the trooper that lay bleeding on the ground with a gunshot wound to the face and the two responding officers.
The state then compared Officer Casey with the defendant and the defendant's associates.
Officer James Casey was on routine patrol for the Arizona Department of Public Safety. Now, at that point in his public service career, he'd already served 4 years in the Air Force, 8 years as a city cop back in Massachusetts, and nearly 10 years at the Arizona Department of Public Safety. He was riding alone in his marked vehicle, fully uniformed. At that time, he came off of the I-17 and was going to turn back around on Indian School Road when a vehicle caught his attention. It was a 2008 blue Mercury Sable, and he could tell immediately that there was a window tint violation. The tint was way too dark. Now, on that same night, the defendant was in the car. He lived in a different world. He was a well-known member of the Arizona Mexican Mafia, and he went by the street name of Mono, M-O-N-O. He was with another member of the Arizona Mexican Mafia, Danny Vargas. Now, Danny Vargas, he also had a street name or a moniker, and he went by Lil Sinner, L-I-L. That's who he ran with. And that night, before the car stopped, you'll hear that the defendant also had his girlfriend with him, Valerie Jaime. He had a street name, Traviesa, or Trouble.
The prosecution went for about 30 minutes during opening, the defense for only about 2 minutes, the defense arguing that reasonable doubt existed because no one pinpointed the defendant.
Ms. Dahl just recited the state's hopes in relation to this case, but the evidence has a big hole, and the hole is a credible identification of the shooter. It's not was someone shot at, it's a credible identification of the shooter. And because Mr. Bueno doesn't have the burden of proof, I don't need to go on and on this morning, and that's what the trial is for. We would ask during the trial that you pay attention as best you can, take notes, ask questions through the basket, and then view the evidence that you hear, all of it, through the lens of reasonable doubt, and suspend your judgment until the evidence is concluded, closing arguments are completed, and Her Honor has read to you your final jury instructions. One thing you should take with you as this trial begins is that Trooper Casey picked someone else out of a lineup. Not Ramon Bueno, someone else. And that's where it begins.
Let's go now to testimony from a trooper. The victim called for backup. This trooper described the moment when the seemingly routine traffic stop turned into anything but.
That moment, I heard a incredibly loud sound, and I saw a muzzle blast engulf his head. And what I refer to a muzzle flash is the flame that comes out of a handgun after it's been fired. It completely engulfed his face. He disappeared.
Where was that muzzle flash? Near?
The muzzle flash came directly out of the vehicle. From my vantage point, it appeared to be no less than a foot away from his face.
What did you see and hear next?
So I wore an earpiece on my right ear. The initial gunshot was so loud, it caused my left ear. I had struggled to hear, so everything became very muffled. After the muzzle flash, I saw Trooper Casey disappear. And what I mean by disappear is body went down.
That trooper then ran over to the victim and checked to see if he was still alive.
I felt if he had any chance to survive whatsoever, I was probably his best choice. So I ran up to him and I straddled his body, and I was looking at his face, and initially I could just see a little bit of blood on his face, and I noticed that his eyes were open, but they were completely rolled back, and he had what we refer to as coded, which he did not have a pulse, and he was not breathing at that moment. I was feeling for an exit wound. I was screaming his name out over and over again, Casey, Casey, on the sheer hope that if he was dead or dying, that maybe he could hear me. And probably about the third or fourth time I yelled his name, he let out a grunt, which in the police world we refer to as a death gasp. A lot of people, when they pass away, their body releases air and gas inside their body and they make one last moan or groan.
Did you think that was a death gasp?
I believed that was a death gasp, and I just heard his last.
Let's jump in here to break down the testimony thus far. Linda Kenney Baden here along with Dina and Joseph Scott Morgan. So Linda, this is graphic testimony. It sounds like it's right out of a novel. It's descriptive. We feel like we're there. Does this defendant stand a chance?
Well, it's very hard. I mean, I felt like I was riding along with Ronaldo Cruz. I've never seen a witness like this, quite frankly, Aaron, in decades, describing this horrible situation and tragedy and shooting. But he stands a chance if indeed Trooper Casey did identify somebody else out of the lineup, and the defense attorney, it doesn't seem to be one that's going to, let's say, do with a lot of cross-examination that's irrelevant. He's going straight to his theme.
I like that. Look, I mean, oftentimes we see defense attorneys try to spin their wheels, Attorney Dina Dahl. Here, it seems like the defense has a couple of key themes for reasonable doubt, told jurors, hey, look, take notes, ask questions, remember the burden of proof, and remember these 2 or 3 things that are going to be problematic with the state's case. The question, of course, is it enough for the defendant? And I realize people may accuse me of flipping the burden here.
Yeah, good point. We are very early on, but I imagine the prosecution is going to be putting on the other people in the car, the women in the car, to try to bolster the case that Bueno was indeed the shooter. If the defense does a good job at poking the hole in that testimony, then a mistaken identity might be enough for this defense.
Joseph Scott Morgan, you deal with forensics. In a case where there's a possible issue with identification, such as this one, surely the state's going to run through the forensics to try to match this defendant up with this crime.
Yeah, they will, Aaron. We're going to hear about lighting in this particular case. We're going to hear about the relationship of the end of the muzzle. Remember, Trooper Cruz mentioned that he thought there was about a foot's worth of closure here. And we'll also hear a lot about window tinting, I think. In Arizona in particular, they don't have a top level bottom back window level for darkening of the tint. It can be as dark as you want it to be. That only applies to the forward area of the car. So you're going to hear a lot of technical data that's going to come out, as well as police procedure issues.
Certainly, Linda Kenney Baden, of course, the tinting of the windows was the rationale for the stop in the first place, but the tinting also may be the reason we have issues with identification here.
Right, and also the tinting may have been throughout the whole car, as I was gathering it, which would be illegal, which would give rise to the stop, and under Arizona law, that would then be a perfectly legal stop.
Certainly a lot to watch as this case moves forward. And now to 2 other big cases we're tracking here at Law&Crime. Alabama prosecutors are now filing murder charges and are seeking the death penalty in the killing of Anaya Blanchard. She is the stepdaughter of a UFC fighter. Ibrahim Yazid is the defendant, already charged with kidnapping Blanchard by forcing her into a vehicle. He will face that additional murder charge for Blanchard's death. Blanchard disappeared in late October. Her remains turned up last week, and an autopsy revealed she had been shot. 2 other defendants are also charged in that case. A civil trial is underway against a wealthy Connecticut husband suspected of making his estranged wife disappear. The estate of the father of the missing wife, Jennifer Doulos, is suing the husband, Fotis Doulos, over loans her family says he owes them. Fotis Doulos and his girlfriend, Michelle Troconis, face criminal charges in Jennifer's disappearance as well. Testimony in the civil case will likely revolve around finances at issue, not the disappearance. And still ahead tonight here on The Debrief, we're tracking the trial of millionaire real estate heir Robert Durst. Plus, we're back to the case against Mark Sievers. The state has rested. The defense is presenting a twisted case involving a possible love triangle as motive as a husband sits accused of killing his doctor wife. That case when we return.
What happens inside courtrooms? You won't believe it until you see it for yourself. Take a front row seat inside real courtrooms and hear firsthand from those who are there.
Grant me 5 minutes in a locked room with a demon.
I'm Dan Abrams, and this is Court Cam.
Court Cam. New series premieres Thursday, December 5th at 9 on A&E.
A hearing scheduled today in the prosecution of Robert Durst has been delayed. You've probably seen a couple of films about this case. Durst is the millionaire real estate heir who prosecutors say killed a woman because he wanted to silence her. Authorities say that victim knew Durst had killed his own wife decades earlier. We'll try to bring you the hearing once it happens West Coast time. The actual trial in this case is scheduled for February. And now to the trial of a Florida man accused of killing his wife and business partner. Mark Sievers charged with being the ringleader behind the murder of Dr. Teresa Sievers. A colleague found Dr. Sievers beaten to death with a hammer in her own home. Husband Mark Sievers is on trial right now. Co-defendant Curtis Wright pleaded guilty and testified against both the husband and the third co-defendant, Jimmy Rogers. Rogers is in prison after a second-degree murder conviction, which we brought you earlier here on Law and Crime. Prosecutors rested their case after calling the medical examiner to describe Dr. Sievers' injuries.
There was lacerations or impact trauma on the top of the head, on the left side of the head, as well as in the back of the head. There were multiple blunt impact injuries. Palpating those injuries, I was able to feel fractures underneath them or depressed skull fractures. And all the injuries were created by an object with a smaller surface area because I have depressed skull fractures. And so there isn't that, when the bone bends inward, because all of that force is directed to a small surface or small surface area, that inward bending causes fracturing at that site without that distal fracturing. The skull has been fractured and you can actually see visible brain, and the brain matter has been pulpified or fragmented. Minimally, there's probably about 17 impacts here to the head itself. That's just a guess based upon the number of injuries. Injury to this part of the brain is fatal. It can put a person into neurogenic shock. They most certainly would have lost consciousness almost immediately.
And what did you determine the cause of death to be?
Blunt head trauma.
On cross-examination, the defense asked the medical examiner about his remarks that the injuries were from a claw hammer, not a ball-peen hammer. Remember, co-defendant Curtis Wright said co-defendant Jimmy Rogers used a claw hammer, but Rogers' ex-girlfriend said she saw him with a ball-peen hammer.
The head of the hammer have about a similar size in terms of their diameter. So it's hard sometimes to tell the class of the hammer that's used in creating an injury when you're using the head of the hammer. So for instance, a ball peen hammer, the peen portion is rounded, would create an injury that probably looks a little different. The claw portion of the hammer, if that was used to strike, would create a characteristic injury. But the head of the hammer, it's hard for me to tell what hammer was used.
Can you tell me, from the photographs, from your examination, how many assailants attacked Dr. Sievers?
I cannot.
Okay. Doctor, can you definitively say that there was more than one hammer used?
I cannot.
The defense called a sheriff's department lieutenant back to the stand to testify about whether Dr. Teresa Sievers and her husband, who was also her office manager, could have, in theory, split up without any drama.
You also indicated that Teresa, I believe your statement was she's going to take the show on the road and up and move away. Do you recall saying that?
It sounds like something I said, yes.
Do you know where she was going to move to?
No.
Do you know when she was going to move?
No.
Did it appear that any financial transactions had taken place that would wind down a business or set up a new lease or mortgage in a different place?
Not that I was aware of, no.
Okay. And at the time, were you aware of Mr. Sievers' occupation?
Yes.
He was the office manager of the medical practice, is that correct?
Yes.
He had no other job, is that right?
Other than assisting with raising his 2 children. That's the only 2 jobs I was aware of.
Is it fair to say then that there was really nothing anchoring Mr. Sievers then to Southwest Florida?
I don't agree with that.
Do you believe that if Dr. Sievers were to move to another state, that Mr. Sievers would stay here?
No, I think he would go with her.
The defense noted that defendant Mark Sievers still owned his own condominium in Missouri and suggested he could have gone there if his marriage fell apart. The defense also asked the lieutenant about his investigation into an alternate suspect, but the prosecution said that other suspect had been cleared.
During your investigation, you found that Angie Wright never came to Florida, right?
Yes.
Never had any reason to see Dr. Sievers dead?
Correct.
Never had any reason whatsoever to be involved in this homicide, isn't that correct?
Correct.
If Angie Wright had been involved in this homicide, had been a co-conspirator, you would have had her arrested too, isn't that correct?
Yes.
And she wasn't arrested because she wasn't involved, right?
Correct.
She was talking to potential witnesses in Missouri.
Yes.
Told them one thing and tried to get them to say something different, isn't that correct?
Yes.
In fact, it was the witnesses that told you about this, isn't that correct?
Yes.
And you wanted her to stop.
Yes.
And did she in fact stop trying to walk the witnesses back on their statements?
Yes, she did.
Ms. Wright was tampering with witnesses, is that correct?
That's one way to look at it.
Mr. Hunter asked you about the condo as an escape plan. Is that something, to your knowledge, that he recently purchased?
No.
And in fact, that's a condo that he co-owned with Dr. Teresa Sievers, correct?
I can't remember if her name was also on the mortgage or not.
Sievers' defense called co-defendant Curtis Wright back to the stand to describe text messages between the men, the alleged co-conspirators, in the months leading up to the murder. The defense said Mark Sievers and Curtis Wright were close. The question is just how close?
Sorry to ask, but are you still going to be able to send me a check? If so, when? Just trying to plan hang things. Do you recall sending that?
No. Yeah, I see that I did, but I don't remember that.
You don't remember that? Do you remember Mr. Sievers writing you back, no worries, already asking how many months do you need? Ideally, I want to send you $2K for 10 months, but cannot send that much with the sad emoji.
Okay.
What should I wear to your wedding? No, not Angie's panties again. Do you recall getting a text like that from Mr. Sievers?
No, but it doesn't surprise me.
All natural? Did you see that?
These are to me.
You and he had a very close relationship, didn't you?
Yes.
Those messages were months before the killing. On cross, the prosecution followed up with texts between Wright and Sievers from right around the time of the killing.
Hope you're having a nice day. That's on the 27th at 3:17 p.m. UTC -4. On Saturday the 27th, the day before you killed Dr. Sievers, you were on the way to Florida, isn't that correct?
Yes.
And your phone was in Missouri. And then there's no other message to or from Mr. Sievers between 6:27, when you were on your way down here with Mr. Rogers to kill Dr. Sievers, and June 30th, right?
Right.
And then on June 30th, you text him and you said, I just talked to Scott, meaning Scott Sievers, right?
Yes.
You're telling him in the message that you're basically sorry.
Yes.
That message was cover, wasn't it?
Yes. There was real feelings there, but yes. Obviously you already knew what happened.
Scott Sievers didn't have to tell you that Teresa Sievers was dead,
No.
did he?
No.
You knew he was dead.
Yes.
She was dead. In fact, you knew that somebody might at some point see these messages, right?
Yes.
Let's go back to our experts now. Attorney Dina, what do you make of the defense case here? The defense doesn't have to present a case, of course, but the defense is presenting a case. Is there a theory here? Is there a theme? Is it making any sense?
So far, I don't think the defense's case is very convincing. I mean, the jury knows that there's one cooperating. He's already confessed to this crime. He's already confessed to the involvement of Mark Sievers. And then there's a conspirator who is also convicted. So I think the defense has to do a lot more to be convincing than they have so far.
Yeah, and of course we hate saying it that way because the state has the burden of proof, but the defense can't just scattershot a theory at the wall and say, well, you know, maybe these guys weren't involved because there was no DNA, but if they were involved, then the defendant wasn't involved with them, and arguing in the alternative might work in front of an appeals court in a civil case, but in a criminal case, it gets kind of sticky here. Joseph Scott Morgan, the forensics with the medical examiner. Ball peen hammer, claw hammer, it's important because if it wasn't a ball peen hammer, then the ex-girlfriend of the co-defendant didn't see the actual murder weapon here.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And these two, potential weapons are distinctly different. And, it's important to understand what the forensic pathologist is stating here. He can, in fact, state that there is multiple depressed skull fractures. I think he said that there were 17 strikes, but it's impossible, to kind of, narrow this down to the point where you can say that it was either a ball peen hammer or whether it was a standard claw hammer. At the end of the day, she's got multiple depressed skull fractures. And the question is that going to be enough for the jury to make a determination?
You've got a very sharp object and a semi-sharp object hitting soft tissue. It's graphic, but Joseph, again, it's important to remember some things don't exactly line up forensically here with what type of hammer is used. Linda, Kenney, Baden, let's you and I wrap this up here. Yeah. Is the defense got a theory here? I mean, I said I don't think it's a good idea to argue in the alternative in front of a jury. Do you agree with me on that? Yeah,
the defense has a theory that there's no motive to kill her, but really what they should be pointing out to is what is the motive for Curtis Wayne Wright to kill Teresa Sievers independent of Mark Sievers? Was there jealousy? Was there retribution because he wasn't paid the $20,000 that actually was negotiated apparently before the wedding, according to these texts? I haven't heard it from the defense, so I don't know, Aaron.
The defense is going to have to get up there and say this defendant needed his wife alive because he managed the practice with her, that he didn't have that motive. And I'm waiting to hear that argument as well. Thanks a lot to the panelists for joining us tonight. It's been a great discussion. We cover these cases live here on The Debrief Monday through Friday at 5 o'clock on the Law&Crime Network. We'll see you tomorrow.